For Cybercrime Radio, I'm Charlie Osborne. This is Redefining Authentication, a cybercrime magazine podcast series brought to you by Keyless Technologies, which offers strong, privacy-focused, passwordless authentication that dramatically reduces ATO fraud whilst improving the user experience for customers and the workforce. To learn more about our sponsor, visit keyless.io. Today, I'm with Dean Stevenson, Director of Pre-Sales at Keyless. Dean, welcome.
Hey Charlie, thanks for having me, and hey to all the listeners as well.
In this episode, we'll be discussing biometrics and its impact on the financial sector. To kick us off, Dean, can you introduce yourself and tell us more about your role at Keyless?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Dean Stevenson. I head up pre-sales, delivery, customer success and support at Keyless. So really we're all of the technical facing customer teams. So we work with the customers right from sort of the early initial interactions at the point where they're just a prospect, and we're identifying their requirements and crafting a solution that will meet those requirements, all the way through to the actual implementation and go live, to making sure that the customer continues to be happy after go live, making sure that any issues that they raise are swiftly resolved and they continue to get the most out of the solution post go live as well, and that they benefit from any new features. So that's really my role at Keyless. I'm relatively new to the company, been with Keyless for around about 5 months now or so. But before that, I've worked within the identity and access management space for over 10 years now across multiple different vendors, the likes of Transmit Security, HID Global. And throughout that time, I've worked mainly in a pre-sales and delivery capacity, working predominantly with banking and financial services customers. So I've worked on some incredibly large and complex identity and access management projects over the last decade or so, on both the workforce side and the consumer side. But really where my area of specialism lies is within customer identity and access management and customer authentication specifically. So dealing with, when it comes to banks, people that are external to that bank. So people that are logging in to access their internet or mobile banking, and crafting a solution that can secure those everyday interaction and those most secure interactions.
And Dean, in your experience working with banks, what makes biometric authentication so attractive to them? I mean, what can biometrics deliver that other authentication methods cannot?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, biometric authentication, maybe if we take a step back actually and talk about authentication as a whole, really predominantly you've got three types of authentication factor. You've got knowledge-based authentication, you've got possession authentication, and inherent authentication. Now, knowledge is something that the user knows. That could be a username, password, PIN, secret question and answer. And the reason that's secure is typically only the user should know that. However, users tend to share that information, or that information can be quite easily stolen. So I could trick a user into divulging that information to me. I could go on their social media, find out their pet's name and their birthday, and sort of have an educated guess at what their password might be, or something a bit more sophisticated as well. Perhaps I could orchestrate a phishing attack to get them to divulge that information to me. Then moving across, you've got possession elements, so something that the user has. This could be a hardware token, it could be a smart card, it could be a mobile device with an enrolled authenticator on it. Now, these are more secure than knowledge factors generally, because in order to compromise a possession factor, you have to actually physically steal that element in order to use that as an authentication factor on a user's behalf. So the attack is slightly more sophisticated. With knowledge-based authentication, I could phish that user's credential anywhere in the world and use it from anywhere in the world on that user's behalf. Possession adds another layer to that. You have to actually physically have that device in order to be able to use it. Now, biometrics fall in the bucket of the inherence-based authentication factors. And what they uniquely offer is real proof of presence at the time of authentication. So with a biometric, whether it's the user's face in terms of facial recognition as an authentication factor, whether it's a fingerprint, an iris scan, a behavioral biometric, only that user can provide that authentication factor that's previously been enrolled. So at that time, you know that the user is physically there and present. And actually, biometric authentication is garnering a lot of interest at the moment. It's increasingly being adopted by banks and financial institutions as a strong factor of authentication, particularly for those most secure, high risk transactions, such as account recovery or a high risk payment, for example.
But Dean, there often is a trade-off between security and user convenience. So how does biometric authentication strike the right balance for banks and their customers?
Yeah, again, really great question, Charlie. So I think, the classic trade-off between customer experience and security, I've been having these types of conversations for a number of years. And I guess, initially that was very much true. There was a trade-off between customer experience and security, particularly when we were talking about multi-factor authentication a decade or so ago. It was very much the case that banks and businesses had implemented username and password-based authentication. And then in order to increase the level of security, they would layer in another authentication factor. So it would add another step to the customer experience. And depending on that authentication factor, it might even add several steps. So you could, for example, have a username, a password, then a hardware token that the user would have to fish out of their drawer. They might have to put a card into it. They might have to enter their PIN to generate a one-time password, to take that one-time password, to enter it in the portal or the application to then authenticate. And along that journey, there are many, many things that could go wrong. The user might not be able to find the card reader. They might not remember their PIN or their password. So there were many points of friction in that journey, but it was generally regarded as a very secure experience. So that was generally where we had these conversations about the trade-off between customer experience and security. Nowadays, though, that's a bit of a false dichotomy. You can very much have a strong, secure customer experience that's also really, really frictionless. What we do at Keyless is we actually provide biometric authentication with a possession factor. So we provide an inherently multi-factor authentication solution. So in addition to using the user's face, where they just glance into a camera and it takes around about 3 to 400 milliseconds to authenticate that user, under the hood, we're also proving possession of a previously enrolled device. So if we've seen that device before, we have a higher level of assurance. So not only do we biometrically authenticate the user in around about 3 to 400 milliseconds, in the background, we're also doing the possession-based authentication of that specific device as well. So from a customer experience perspective, it's actually just one step and a very quick step at that. But you're actually getting two factors of authentication immediately, meaning that banks can meet their compliance requirements, but the actual customer experience is very frictionless. In some cases, too frictionless. It seems very quick to the end user, but actually it's incredibly secure at the same time. So, what I would say is nowadays there isn't really a trade-off between usability and security anymore when it comes to authentication.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
Say goodbye to passwords, PINs, and OTPs, and welcome to passwordless authentication with Keyless. As the leader in privacy-preserving biometrics, Keyless can authenticate your customers and employees without storing their biometric data anywhere. With a fast-growing customer base in the banking, fintech, and gaming sectors, join us as we redefine how the world authenticates. To learn more, visit keyless.io.
And now, back to the podcast.
So, what are the most common use cases where banks are implementing biometric authentication? How does this technology enhance security and user experience?
Yeah, so there are many different use cases where biometric authentication can be used. Obviously, it can replace any of the traditional authentication factors. So anywhere a username, password, SMS OTP, or a physical token could have been used, you can replace that for biometric authentication. So if we continue the example when we're talking about banks and financial institutions, that could be when the user logs in. So securing those day-to-day interactions. But actually, one of the areas where we see biometric authentication being applied, at least initially, is actually in those high-risk scenarios. So because it's such a strong authentication factor, we increasingly see banks and businesses using it at the time of, let's say, for example, making a payment, or making a payment where you're not quite sure that that user is who they're claiming to be. So a step-up transaction in this example. So if the user's making a payment for £10, £20, £30, maybe you let them through with no authentication whatsoever. They've already logged into the application. Maybe that's enough to allow them to make a small transaction. However, as that transaction amount starts to creep up, maybe £1,000, maybe £10,000, you're buying a car or putting down a deposit on a house, well, actually, then the risk is really high. Therefore, biometric authentication lends itself really well in that scenario because you can invoke biometrics like a facial recognition, and you can authenticate the user, you can get true proof of presence, and crucially, as a bank, in doing so, you get non-repudiation. So the user can't actually dispute that they were physically there and present at the time of making a transaction, which is notoriously difficult when you're using other authentication factors in a digital context. And, back to one of your earlier questions, that's one of the benefits of using biometrics. You get true proof of presence. So, that's one of the types of use cases where we're seeing biometrics being applied. But also increasingly, we're having conversations around device recovery or app rebinding. So when we're talking to banks, this tends to be the Achilles heel in the customer experience from a security perspective. Now, the mobile apps nowadays for banks, they're typically used as a credential. So the user can use their app to sign in and to authorize transactions. There's typically a cryptographic binding in the back end that accompanies that. But attackers tend to exploit the rebinding process in order to get an app bound on their device in someone else's name so that they can authorize transactions. I speak to a lot of banks that have problems with attackers and fraudsters exploiting this device rebinding process, which typically might be secured with a username, a password, an SMS OTP, all of which can be really easily phished. But once the attacker's got those, then they can gain access to the app that's bound to their device, and then they can execute transactions on behalf of that user. So by replacing that process and layering in biometrics, actually that can almost eradicate that style of attack, because as the user's going through the app rebinding process, you can get the user to biometrically authenticate using their face, and you know that it's actually them at the time of doing that app rebinding. So we've seen a significant reduction in that style of account takeover where banks have been using biometric authentication for that specific use case. So it tends to be, device rebinding, account recovery, high value payments. Those tend to be the main use cases for biometric authentication. But then as our customers see that it's quite easy to use, but incredibly secure, they're also applying it in other areas like login, for example.
And on that note, Dean, could you walk us through some examples of banks that have successfully deployed biometric authentication? And what were the key business outcomes they achieved?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been working with a number of banks here in Europe. One bank, as an example, a large European bank, I'll keep them nameless for this podcast, one of the largest banks in Europe in the top 10. We've been working with them on that exact use case, so the device rebinding use case. And in that example, we were able to reduce the device rebinding time from over a minute to less than 10 seconds. So it became incredibly easy, yet still incredibly secure for customers to go through that rebinding process. Previously, before they were using keyless and biometric authentication, it was actually quite cumbersome to go through that process. I think we've all been in a situation where you've bought a new phone, you're really excited, you can't wait to get up and running with it, but actually then you remember that you have to go through this rebinding process for all of your apps, or certainly all of the secure apps that are installed on your device. So actually, by making that significantly easier, we reduced the abandonment rate and significantly reduced account takeover in that example as well. We reduced account takeover actually by around about 80% for that specific use case. So a significant reduction in the actual friction from a customer experience perspective, a significant reduction in fraud, but also massive cost savings as well. So by replacing SMS OTPs, by replacing passwords, we're significantly reducing the impact on the help desk. Customers forget their passwords. They might not get SMS OTPs delivered to their device in a timely fashion, or might not get them delivered at all. They may have changed their mobile number, therefore they can't receive an SMS OTP in the first place. And also there's fixed costs of sending things like SMS OTPs. So in this example, actually, we were able to deliver cost savings of around about $4 million in the first year as well. So significant savings from an operational perspective as well.
So, we've talked about the benefits of biometric authentication, but what are some of the risks or concerns that make banks cautious about adopting it? And also, how can these risks be mitigated?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest concerns when I'm speaking to banks and they're thinking about adopting biometrics, typically the biggest concern that they have is around the biometric data itself. So storing biometric data is a massive concern for anyone, whether they're a bank or a business. It typically creates this central honeypot of biometric data that attackers would absolutely love to gain access to. Also, there's legislation, certainly in the EU, but also in other areas of the world, that makes it incredibly difficult for banks to store this data. There's all sorts of hoops that they have to jump through in order to do so in a compliant way. But what we do at Keyless is we actually alleviate that main concern. The way that we do biometric authentication when it comes to facial biometrics is we actually don't store any biometric data anywhere, not on the device, not on a server. And we do that through our own proprietary privacy-preserving biometric transformation. So when the user enrolls, we perform a one-way cryptographic transformation of the biometric, and we store that remotely on our server. Now, that means that we're not storing a photo of the user, we're not storing a biometric template, and we're not storing a hash. So our own proprietary protocol means this is truly a one-way encryption, so that anyone with, in theory, access to the Keyless servers wouldn't be able to use any of that data. It would be completely meaningless to them. So there's no risk of any biometric data being lost or stolen there. So that's typically, one of the main concerns when it comes to biometric authentication. And certainly, one of the reasons that I joined Keyless in the first place, because there's a really elegant solution to enabling banks to use biometric authentication, but without storing any biometric data whatsoever.
Dean, thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
No, thank you, Charlie.
For Cybercrime Radio, I'm Charlie Osborne. Redefining Authentication is a Cybercrime magazine podcast series brought to you by Keyless Technologies, which offers strong, privacy-focused, passwordless authentication that dramatically reduces ATO fraud whilst improving the user experience for customers and the workforce. To learn more about our sponsor, visit keyless.io. For more of our media, visit our website at cybersecurityventures.com.